Good morning, Life Group leaders. I hope you're doing well, and I pray your study in Mark has been fruitful for you and for your group. I know it has been a good challenge for all of us as we look at what does it mean that Christ came to die for us and save us from our sins, as we see in the passage today with verse 45. Right, Jesus came not to be served, but to serve. And really, this is one of the driving verses for the book of Mark. And as we look at it today, I'm going to provide my notes so you can see kind of going off of my outline if that would be helpful. But I'm hoping really to direct most of this discussion to help our life group see who God is and how, as Christ, we see God magnified, and through the lens of Christ that we would understand this passage. Some of my group are trying to understand, developing their theology of who Christ is and what does that mean and how do we live like Christ. And really, this passage shows us a really key piece as the disciples have continuously misunderstood why Jesus came. Right, we saw all the way back in first chapter. Peter walks in and is like, "What are you doing?" Jesus is praying, and he's focusing on the focus is on his Father and his Father's will, and they seem to be focused more on, "Hey, there's a bunch of people we need to heal. Where have you been?" And over and over and over again, we just see this pattern, and it culminates today, or this weekend when we look at Mark 10. I'm going to try to cover everything between 32 through 45. I want to provide some context as we go into that, reminding them what's happened a little bit leading into this. Really, the interesting piece is that previously the disciples in chapter 9 were trying to figure out, well, who's the greatest among us? Right? And Jesus says, no, you need to be a servant, having a servant's heart, because they keep missing that. And so as we look at the text today, I think it's helpful that when we get to the third prediction of Jesus' death, that they miss it again. And so let's take a look at the text. I don't know if you provide a lot of backdrop, but as you get them ready to look at what's going on in Mark, the driving thing that I'm going to try to show them is that because Jesus is the Messiah, he's the suffering servant who would lay down his life that we might live. And I think it's helpful because a lot of times we look at Jesus, we know he goes and dies on the cross because of our sin, but I think a lot of times we also forget he joyfully put himself there. He chose to die on the cross to save us. He chose to lay down his life because he loved us. And as we look at the text today, we see Jesus is he's walking, right? And when we look at 32, he's walking ahead of the group, marching towards Jerusalem, knowing he's going to die. And there's beauty in that, even though it seems ironic that the Messiah is going to die at the hands of the Gentiles. Jesus is going to Jerusalem. They're sending up, right? It says they're going up. And when they get there, he lays down his life. And it's radical because that's not what you would expect if you were a first century Jew waiting on the Messiah. They would be thinking, when Jesus or the Messiah gets here, he's going to take down the empire. He's going to restore order. The Jews will reign, take down the Gentiles, we'll get our city back, our Messiah will extend his kingdom, and God's going to do all these cool things, but it's going to elevate us in this military political power. And you see that plays into the disciples, even when they're grumbling after James and John make their request. So the way I'm going to kind of break down the passage, 32 through 34 will be his prediction about his life, death, and resurrection. Verses 35 through 40, we're going to see Jesus talk about the seat of power, the cup of wrath, and the baptism of suffering. And then 41 through 45, leading up to the verse that summarizes all of Mark, that we must be servants of many, not lording it over all. Because Jesus, as the Son of Man, he didn't come to be served, right? He came to serve. So that's really driving all of this discussion. So as they're just going to walk this through them, going through my notes, Jesus and his disciples, they head to Jerusalem. They're on this way, and they're heading up towards Jerusalem as they're going from the valley, leaning Capernaum, Jordan Valley area. And as they're going, this crowd follows them. The text indicates Jesus is ahead of them as he's going through. His disciples are following him. It might be in a single line. Some scholars say that the custom, when a rabbi leads, they follow. His followers would go after him in a straight line as they walk. But notice Jesus has been predicting his death already a couple times. And so it says there's tension in the crowd. The crowds are amazed, but they're also afraid. So the disciples are there, the crowds are there. There might be some Gentiles, but I think it's primarily Jews because as we know, Jesus will die during Passover. And so a lot of a lot of Jews will take a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the various feasts. And so we know there's typically 3 a year. There's the Passover, unleavened bread festival, there's Pentecost, and then there's Tabernacle. And so because this is springtime when Jesus dies, we assume that, or we know it's the Passover, and we see that in the text. So as they're going, there's a massive group of people heading towards Jerusalem. It's not just there's 100 people. There's thousands upon thousands going to Jerusalem because they want to participate in this Passover meal and this festival. And so as they're going, right, we mentioned the crowds are afraid. Why would they be afraid? Most likely because Jesus has been saying, I'm going to die. I'm going there and I'm going to die. And so as he goes, keep that in mind. The tension is building. He's going knowing his death. But as he lays out in the text, he's going up there specifically to be handed over to the chief priests, right, the religious experts of the law, the leaders, and they're going to condemn him, right? They're going to turn him over to the Gentiles, which in this case is the Romans, which there's irony in that, right? The Jewish Messiah is going to be handed over. The Son of Man, the Messiah, is going to be handed over to the other nation, right? The foreign nation that has oppressed the Jews forever, and they are going to kill their Messiah. So you see the twist to the text, and it really presses down on us like this is a serious and weighty thing. But also notice that it gives the prediction. He tells them this is the most descriptive of all the prediction text. But it shows that they're going to mock him, spit on him, flog him severely, and kill him. But after 3 days, he will rise again. So on the third day, he will rise again. What a beautiful testament. And this is the gospel. This is what gives us hope. This is what gives us life. So as you pour into your people, help them to see the necessity that Jesus came knowing he had to die. It wasn't by accident. And so maybe there's some tension. Maybe Jesus is feeling like, okay, I've shared with them. They know that I'm the Messiah. They're clearly not understanding it, but I need to teach them and guide them. So he gives them this third prediction. He walks to the, knowing that he's going to die. He goes through the crowds. They're following him. You see this tension. And then he instructs his disciples what's going to take place. And the hard part is, it's one of his disciples that are going to betray him. Right? Notice every time Jesus shares these things, there's something going on with the disciples. Right? The first time Jesus tells them, Peter rebukes him. He's like, no, you're wrong. And then Jesus has to rebuke Peter, and then he instructs all of them that, no, this is what's going to happen. And then we see after the second one, some other things going on, and the transfigurations happen. So it's very clear that Jesus has revealed himself, that he is the Messiah. He's not keeping things secretive anymore. And so as he goes, he tells them what's going to happen. So he'll be handed over to the Romans, betrayed by his own people. He'll be mocked, spit on, which we'll see happens in his trial. Then he gets flogged. I don't know if you want to go too much into this, but the flogging it's a very painful process, right? They would take a cat of nine tails. So imagine a whip with these strands that have glass and metal bits, and they flail the prisoner's back, and they get them to the point of death, but they don't kill them. They get them to the brink, 39 lashes. And the idea is that they are inflicting so much pain, accelerating the pain. I don't know if it's to help in the process, but I think it's to magnify the suffering that the criminal would have on the cross. And so Jesus is going to experience this for us and the disciples because he loves us. And so hopefully we can help them see that Jesus did this not just because we are sinful, but because he loves us. It's both and. And yes, Jesus is fully God and fully man. And you might get that question of what do we do? How do we wrestle with the fact that if he's God, how can he die? But the thing is, he doesn't fully die. I mean, in the sense, he doesn't stay dead, right? Yes, he dies on the cross. He's in the tomb for 3 days. Then he rises again. You and I can't do that, right? But if I'm the God of the living, why can't I do that? And so Jesus, being fully God, has the ability to rise again. And we know that he does this by the Father's will through the Holy Spirit. So you might get some pushback on that and some questions. Don't be afraid of that question. It's a good question. But we also have to show this humanity. Jesus lived the perfect life, and he died to be a ransom for many, which he says later on. Why? Because we can't save ourselves. So maybe there's some people visiting your life group who've never heard the gospel. This is it, guys. This is a great way to share the gospel with our people. But we also know it says that we'll know he'll be put on a cross, right? The cross was a humiliating thing. You might have talked with someone about this before. But Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 through 23 comes to mind. If a person is put on a tree, he is cursed. And we know that Jesus takes on flesh and dies on a cross or the tree, and he's cursed on our behalf. He takes on our sin. And so he's fulfilling Old Testament prophecies again and again and again, right? We see that with Isaiah 53 as well, which will come later. He says the Son of Man will rise again. So we see that Jesus has predicted his life, or not his life, but the next few days, what's going to take place, his betrayal, his humiliation, his trial, and his murder, and his resurrection. But notice he ends on hope. He doesn't say, well, that's it, I'm just going to die. But he sets the stage. Over 21 times, Jesus has told them that he's going to be resurrected between these four gospel accounts. So there is hope, right? He will suffer, but he will live again. And he's intentional because he wants to prepare them for what's going to happen. Because after he dies, what happens? He's going to ascend to the heavens, and then as we talked about Acts last Sunday, then they are going to be faithful and live on mission and expand the kingdom. And we'll see this is how the church comes to life after Pentecost takes place. To help our people see the necessity of Jesus' death, I'll probably focus more on this part than I will in the other pieces. But as time allows, notice that we're going to transition. Right after Jesus said, I'm going to die for you, James and John go, hey, by the way, can we sit with you in your glory? Because I think it'd be great, right? If you read Matthew's account, it's because of their mom. Their mom said, hey, go ask about this. So Jesus interacts with them, and they come and say, teacher, right? Typically, teacher, we have a question for you. Do for us whatever you would ask. Which now we see in the text, something's wrong. They're missing it. They think, oh, we want to sit in power because we know the Messiah, he's going to go and overthrow the kingdom. So they completely miss what Jesus just said. I'm not sure how much time goes on between verses 34 and 35. But James and John come up with a very selfish request showing that they think the Messiah is going to overthrow the kingdom, which when we look at why the disciples grumble, or the 10 grumble over what they ask, I think it's because they also want in that seat of power, right? We're following the teacher. We're seeing the master do his work. He is God. We're seeing all these things. He just told us this, but we're focusing on the wrong things, which we've seen is consistent in Mark's gospel. Mark has consistently shown us the disciples and the Pharisees and the others misunderstand why Jesus is here. Jesus isn't here just to cast out demons and heal people. He's here to save people. He's here to preach the kingdom and repentance, and so that others can believe. And what a gift that is. But it's easy for them and for us to misunderstand this, which is similar to what happened last week with the disciples not being able to exorcise the demon from the little boy. So Jesus says, what do you want from me? And they say, please let us sit on your right and left. And then as the text goes on, we come to see that they have completely missed it, right, as we said. So Jesus responds, you don't know what you're asking. And it's important because Jesus is correcting them and showing them that they need to understand. But then he poses a question. Are you able to drink the cup, right, in this sense, the cup of wrath that he's going to drink, and be baptized with the baptism I'm going to experience? Because they think they're able to with their response. But notice what Jesus says. He goes, you will drink the cup I drink, and you will be baptized. But you cannot sit at my right hand because it's not mine to give, right? So it's up to the Father who sits to his left and right. He doesn't answer that. But they will face suffering very differently than what Jesus experienced. But here's the most interesting part. James will be the first of the 12 to die. In Acts 12:2, we see this. And later we see that John will be the last. So their request for place of honor, it kind of makes sense in some ways because they've been following, but they misunderstand. And so Jesus then instructs them from 41 through 45. He says, look, you're misunderstanding what's going on. The disciples are now angry at the two because they requested to have a seat of honor, and Jesus shows them, look, you have to be a servant. That's what you got to do. Your glory will be seen in suffering, because that's where God will be revealed. And so as we show them this, we can challenge them. How do we live like Christ, who in verse 45 shows he came specifically to serve, not to be served, right? Even though he's God, he came to die for us. He came to save us. He came to ransom us. So if we can encourage our people to see that, if we can give them those principles, we can then help them to think, okay, how do I live this? How do I live sacrificially? Where in my life can I change? So life group leaders, I want to encourage you. You can do this very simply. You can expand on this, but really we're driving home. Do they understand the necessity that Jesus has to die? Do they understand the weight of what it means to follow Christ? And are they willing to be servants who are willing to lay down their life? You're going to do great. I'm praying for you guys.